would encourage you to open up your Bible back to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. I don't know if Randy is psychic or if he's just really that lucky, but that's exactly where we wanted to begin this morning, Matthew chapter 6, and almost the exact same verses that he chose too, so we're 2 for 2 on that department. Matthew chapter 6, we're going to talk about something that to me is very uncomfortable. It's something that we haven't discussed in quite some time. I actually haven't discussed it at all, I don't think, ever in any sermon that I've ever done. And that's primarily because it's not something that's very comfortable to talk about. What we're discussing this morning is money. And we may talk about forgiveness, we can talk about grace, we can talk about all the things under the sun. But when it comes down to it, money is right up there too, because money can be an indicator of a lot of other things. And so what we're going to be discussing this morning is if money could talk, what types of things would it have to say for us? A lot of times, every sermon, or let me rephrase that, almost every sermon I've ever heard about money had to do with giving. You need to give more, you need to give more, you need to give more. That's not going to be the focus this morning. I think that money can be used as a tool in a lot of ways, but I think the Bible has a lot to say about what you do with your money. And so that's what we're going to be discussing. Today what we're going to be doing is a top 10 list of all the things that if money could talk, what it would say to you and what it would say to me. We're going to be using the scriptures for that. It's not going to be coming from the book of Brady, so it's nothing personal for me to you. But if money could talk, what would it have to say about us? And so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to do a top 10 list, and so we're going to be moving very rapidly. The verse references will be up on the board. I would encourage you to open up your Bible, really follow along. We're going to be moving very quickly. Without further ado, the first thing, number one, if money could talk, the first thing that it would say is, I am not your master. Look with me, if you would, in Matthew chapter 6, starting again in verse 19. Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19, he says, Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now what he puts here in Matthew chapter 6, in those 3 verses, is kind of this ultimatum on everything. He says, don't focus on things that are temporal. We talked about that a little bit during the Bible class. But he says, don't focus on things that are temporal. Focus on bigger things, things that can't be destroyed. Focus on things that can't be stolen. Those are the things where our treasure should be. But look at what he keeps talking about. Verse 22, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, your whole body will then be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? It would be very easy at this point to kind of siphon off these verses and say, well, what we have here is 17 through 19 that talks about treasure in heaven. Then we have verses 19 through 21, which talks about where your treasure is. Then you have 22 and 23 that talks about where your eye is. And then you have verse 24 that talks about where your master is. And kind of siphon off each one of those verses and make them their own standalone unit. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. When you look at these things in context, each one of these ideas builds on the other. Look back at verses 19 through 21. If he's talking to people who have put their treasure on earth, what he's talking about is people in verses 22 and 23 whose eye is full of darkness. People who are only focused on the things of this earth, focused on things of a temporal nature. Verse 22, if your eye is clear, it's because you're focusing on things above. Godliness, righteousness, treasure in heaven, those types of things. All these verses are connected. And look at verse 24, it kind of puts a nice capstone on it when he says, no one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and he will despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Here's a question for you. Kind of put this in perspective. If your boss comes in and tells you that you need to come in on Sunday morning for more overtime, he's going to pay you 3.5 times on Sunday morning, there you have a decision in your head. Are you going to go to services and assemble with the saints? And this is not a pitch for any one thing or the other, but are you going to go to services and assemble with the saints with God's people? Or are you going to come in for that extra overtime because you just want a little bit of extra money? Where is that decision going to go? And the ultimatum is the same in verse 24. You cannot serve 2 masters. You will either hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and hate the other. The point is, you cannot be at work and you cannot be at services. There is going to be a decision made. And you can apply that to a lot of other things in life. You cannot serve God and you cannot serve mammon any more than you can be in 2 different places at one time. I love verse 25 and 26 because it really builds on this. And this is the last section we're going to look at for this. But he says, for this reason I say to you, all the reasons that we had just discussed,
For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Because is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Verse 26, an object lesson. Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? I'm going to level with you here and probably show you a really intimate part of my life that you probably don't see a whole lot. One of my favorite television shows is Shark Tank. Has anybody ever seen that show, Shark Tank? Love that show. Love Robert Herjavec on the end. Love Mark Cuban on the other side. Love that show. Watched it with the Holmes Thursday night for 2.5 hours. Love that show. But as they're talking about all these people, and they're talking about the intros and how this person sold this business for $3.5 billion and this person sold this business for $350 million, they're then showing these people that are making investment in these people's companies, and they're arguing over tens of thousands of dollars, $10,000, $20,000. And at some point you have to step back when you're watching a show like that and think to yourself, if you have $3.5 billion, what are you doing arguing about $20,000? You have to ask yourself that question. And these, by any means, are not people that are in their 20s. These are people that are in their 50s. Their life is set. There is virtually no way they can burn through $3.5 billion in their lifetime. But yet they're still quibbling over that. You know what that shows me? Are people who at the end of their life are still focusing. I'm not saying that people are older at the end of their life. That's not what I'm saying. But people who are up there in age that are still arguing, focus on me, still arguing about things that aren't going to matter anymore. That's what he's talking about here. And when he caps all of this off, verses 25 and 26, he's trying to get us to the point of saying, these things that you're quibbling about, they don't really matter in the long run. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And if your treasure is placed in perishable things, it's going to be your master. And that's where your anxiety is going to be also. Put your hope, put your trust, and put your faith and your confidence in things that are of an eternal nature. Number two, if money could talk, I think it would point blank tell you that I cannot give you happiness. Solomon has a lot to say in the book of Ecclesiastes, if you would flip over there. There's a lot to say in the book of Ecclesiastes, a lot about a lot of different things. In chapter 5, he has this kind of idea about where money goes to. Many people think that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes towards the end of his life. And as he's looking back on his life, he's noticing a lot of different things that he probably would have done differently. Things that he would have focused on. Things that he would have accentuated. Well, look in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, starting verse 10. I love the way he says this. He says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. Doesn't that sound like Kevin O'Neely from Shark Tank? He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with his income. This too is vanity. Vanity, vanity, vanity. Verse 11, when good things increase, those who consume them will increase. So what then is the advantage of their owners except to look on? What he's arguing is this perpetual cycle that we get into when we say, I have $3.5 billion, I want $3.5 billion more. I have $20, I want 20 more. This never-ending cycle. To think to yourself that if I just attain this extra thing, then I'm going to be happy. Look at verse 12. I love what he says here. Verse 12. The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or he eats much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. Do you know why it doesn't allow him to sleep? Because over and over what he's thinking about is how he can attain more. How can I get more of this? How can I get more stuff? Solomon has a lot to say about this specific type of vanity. Proverbs chapter 30, flip a few pages over. Proverbs chapter 30. I told you we'd be moving quickly. Proverbs chapter 30, Solomon provides some warnings on this. He says, keep deception, in verse 8, Proverbs chapter 30, verse 8, keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion. Verse 9, that I may not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. People that believe that money is the thing that's going to buy them happiness miss this. It's kind of like reaching for that apple that's just a little bit farther up. You're going to drop everything that you have. Similar to that dog who has the bone in his mouth and looks down at the lake and he sees the second bone in his reflection, so he reaches down to get it, and when he reaches down to get the second bone, he drops that first bone in the lake, loses everything. It's a problem with people. who believed that money will buy happiness. It was an English philosopher, I can't remember what his name was, but he said there is a God-shaped void in everybody's life. And people try to plug that void with everything except God. Ladies and gentlemen, it simply just does not work. You can't fill that void in your life with anything but God. And you certainly can't fill it with money. Money would also say, I think very honestly, that I won't last forever. We just read Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 through 22 or 21. Look at Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 33. Two verses, Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 33. Jesus writes, or Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Here's an interesting statistic. You can look up a lot of these type of statistics online. Of course, 98% of everything you read online is probably false. This isn't that 2%. I got it from a reputable source. 13% of all home burglaries are the only ones that are solved. 13% of home burglaries are solved. What that means is 87% of all home burglaries are never resolved. Nobody ever knows where that stuff went. What that shows me is when you're talking about people who come in and steal things, if you've been robbed at your house, there's a really, really, really good chance that you're not getting any of that back. Now here's the problem with that. If you sit here and say to yourself, everything that I love is in this house, I love my TV, I love my stereo, I love my computer, I love my video games, I love my dog Sophie, all those things, and that robber takes that, those things are gone, more than likely. Now if your happiness is in those types of things, what's going to happen to you? Your treasure, your happiness is all gone. But let's just say all those things stay with you, and you keep everything, and you build one TV, you have 2 TVs, you have 3 TVs, you have this massive entertainment center. What's going to happen to you when you perish? What did Job say? From dust I came, and from dust I shall return. Somebody said, I think very wisely, you don't ever see a U-Haul coming behind a hearse, and that's true. Because what you have in this life is for this life only. And Solomon says several times in Ecclesiastes, enjoy these things of your life now. Because there's no pleasure in the grave where you're going in a physical sense. But if these things we think are going to go with us forever, and that we're going to stand before God and say to ourselves, look at all the things that I've amassed, then we're totally missing the point. God is not nearly as impressed with our status at a job or our bank account as we are. That's something that I think all of us need to take to heart. I think he would also say, we're going to do 2 of these at the same time. I think he would also say that I am your charge. And what I mean by that is I am your responsibility. Look at the 19th chapter, starting in verse 15. Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 15. We don't think of money as being our responsibility. We think of it as being our fun factor, that we get to use it for whatever it is that we want to use it for in life. In Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 15. It's the parable of the minas, and it differs from the parable of the talents in a small way. But we understand the basic idea of it. Where a person goes off into the distance and he has everything kind of in the charge of his servants. Look in verse 15. Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 15. It says, when this master returned after receiving the kingdom, he ordered that these slaves to whom he had given the money, those that were in his charge, he called to him so that he might know what business had been done. And the first then appeared very righteously, saying, Master, your mina has made 10 minas more. And the master responded in verse 17, saying, well done, good slave. Because you have been faithful in a very little thing, you are to be in authority over 10 cities. The second came, saying, your mina, master, has made 5 minas. And he said to him also, you are to be over 5 cities. Notice that proportion there. Verse 20. Another came, saying, Master, here is your mina, which I kept put away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you because you are an exacting man. You take up what you did not lay down, you reap what you did not sow. And he said to him, by your own words, verse 22, I will judge you, you worthless slave. Did you not know that I am an exacting man, taking up what I did not lay down and reaping what I did not sow? Verse 23, then why did you not put my money in the bank at least? And having come, I would have received it with interest. And then he said to the bystanders, take that mina away from him and give it to the one who has the 10 minas. What he's talking about here in Luke chapter 19 is the idea of stewardship. And how everybody in this life, no matter if you're rich or you're poor, all of us have been entrusted with things. The admonition is to make the most of that. Now some people in this world, some people in this congregation, have been much more blessed than other people. There's nothing wrong with that. The question is, what are you doing with it? When we talk about this idea of stewardship, money being our charge, the idea is God has blessed us with those things. We're going to talk about that in a second. But what are you doing with it? The parable of the minas highlights something that the parable of the talents doesn't, and that's the vehement response against this lazy and worthless slave. And I love how the king in verse 23 looks at him and says, you should have at least put my money in the bank, done anything with it. But you didn't. You put it away in a handkerchief, you buried it in the ground, and you forgot about it. And because of that, you are lazy and you are worthless. That's the king saying that. That's not me saying it to anybody here. You are lazy and you are worthless. Heaven forbid any of us stand before God seeing the multitude of blessings that you and I have been given. And all we have to do is look back at our lives and see what we've been given. And God will look at us and say, you didn't do nearly what you should have done with what I gave you. Money is our charge. It's not to be used just so we can buy the fanciest toys, so we can buy everything in this world that we want to. It's given to us to be used. My brother one time told me a long time ago that you use money like you would a screwdriver. You use it as a tool to get things done. It's not your master. It is your slave. I would also argue, and if money could talk, I would say that it says that I need friends. Look at Acts chapter 4. It sounds very sad of money, but I think it's very true. See a remarkable thing within the early church that you don't see a whole lot these days, at least not out in the open, and that's fine. It doesn't need to be as out in the open as it was we're reading about. This is for our instruction. See something in Acts chapter 4 you saw in Acts chapter 2. And that's the ultimate sharing that occurs amongst believers. Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32, it says, the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and of one soul. And not one of them claimed that anything belonging to himself was his own, but all things were common property to them. And with great power the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and abundant grace was upon them all. For there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or of houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them down at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as they had need. The early church in the first century exploded. There was a lot of things going on, a lot of people witnessing what was happening, a lot of people seeing it and seeing that's different. And one of the main reasons that it was different is the same reason that's repeated here as it is in Acts chapter 2. They cared about each other. Now the natural byproduct, the negative side of this is what we saw with Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 4, where they were laying down their money, they were hoping for fame. That's the negative side of this. But what you saw within the early church was people taking of their own things that they didn't need. This goes along with I'm your charge. That's why we're doing both of them together. But people taking of things that they didn't need, and sometimes even things that they did need, and sacrificed them because they saw somebody that needed them much, much more. If I'm sitting here with $200,000 and my brother over there can't make rent, do you think I'll stand before God and answer for how I close my heart to Him? Do you think I will? Now I understand there needs to be wisdom involved in all of this. And you can't just give money blatantly to everybody that asks you, then you'll be bankrupt. That's not the idea here. The idea here is whether or not you're going to close your heart to your brother. The idea is whether or not you're going to look upon a need, whether I'm going to look upon a need and give of my money to help them. Give graciously and give cheerfully. That's also the idea behind what we did just a few minutes ago with the offering. Seeing a need with the church in this situation to expand and to grow, to help support preachers, of which I'm extremely thankful for. But seeing that need and filling it. Do we do that on an interpersonal basis? Or do we close our hearts to that? There's an interesting website if you ever go to it. It's called where'sgeorge.com. It's a fantastic website. What you can do is you can take your dollar bill and you can punch it in. You can punch in the little serial number and you can see all the places that dollar bill has traveled in the United States. Sometimes it goes to Georgia, sometimes it goes to Minnesota, sometimes it goes to Massachusetts. But what it shows is money needs to be used. Money needs to be spread. And it's fascinating to see all the different places, all the different ways that it was used. Money needs friends. Money needs to be shared. And that's, I think, if money could talk, one of the things that it would say. Money would also say, And this is possibly one of the most important ones that we could say the entire morning. Plenty also would say, I came from God. James chapter 1 and verse 17 is probably a verse that's not unfamiliar to too many of us when he says, all good and perfect things come from God. That's an important point to make. Oftentimes what we want to do when we talk about money is we want to say, look at what I have created. Look at what I have built up with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I'm the one that put in the time at L3 that got me this paycheck. I'm the one that worked day after day after day at this job that I can't stand. I'm the one that made that money. When in reality, every Christian understands that it was God who gave us that opportunity in the first place. That it was God who gave us the opportunity to work, the breath in our lungs, to be able to do that thing. All good and perfect gifts come from above. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Genesis chapter 13, verse 2 is a perfect illustration of that. Look at Luke, the 12th chapter, though. I'm sorry, not Luke chapter 12. I don't know where that came from. Look in Deuteronomy 8. My notes here don't match up with my notes there for some reason. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Studying Deuteronomy in our Wednesday night class, I think the study's going well. Howard may disagree with me. I think the study's going fantastic. I'm just kidding, Howard. But one of the main things that's talked about in Deuteronomy is this idea of always leaning towards God. And the problem that the Israelites would have as they're wandering the desert and going towards Canaan is they were always entranced with what would eventually happen. For 40 years they were told, and after the Exodus, they were always told it's going to be a land flowing with milk and honey, that everything they would want would come from God and would be there. And if you can imagine for 40 years thinking that's the place it's going to be. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be open. It's going to be abundant. That's the place it's going to be. People were wanting to be there. But God in Deuteronomy chapter 8 puts a little caveat on there. Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting in verse 11, listen to what he has to say. He says, beware, once you go into Canaan, beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. These things go hand in hand. Verse 12. Otherwise, when you have eaten and you are satisfied, and you have built good houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then, verse 14, after you're rich, then your heart will become proud. And you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness, with its fiery serpents and its scorpions and its thirsty ground where there was no water. He brought water for you out of the rock of the flint. In the wilderness, he fed you with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you, that he might test you, to do good for you in the end. Otherwise, you might say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. The problem with most denominational churches in today's world and denominational teaching is the idea that God is just a crutch to give you whatever you want in life. That God is just going to bless you abundantly with everything that you want. But the flip side of that is, if you don't want anything, then you don't need God. That's the negative flip side of that argument. That God's just here to give you all your best wishes, the Joel Osteen method. Just kind of giving you everything you want. The negative side of that is, if you're happy with your life, you don't need God. That's the negative repercussion of that mindset. So what you have in the world today is a bunch of people thinking, well, I'm not going to come to God because I don't need anything from Him. I'm my own man, I'm a Texan, I'm an American, do everything I want to do. Don't you know that's how the Israelites thought, at least for a little bit? Once they got into Canaan, and all these promises of all the things that they were going to have, they thought, I'm this way, and I've got all this stuff, I've got all these things, look at what I've created. And I don't need God anymore. And yet in saying that, what they forget is that it was God that sent the plagues to get them out of Egypt in the first place. That it was God who parted the waters of the Red Sea so that they could walk and not get drilled over by 6,000 chariots, Egyptian chariots, right behind them. That it was God who fed them with manna and with water when they were in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, which is one of the most barren places in the world. That God fed them. I know, yeah, now they're in Canaan. Now, they wouldn't have lasted those 4 years for 5 seconds. And they forgot that when their heart became proud. When we talk about all the things that we have, we need to rightfully resurrect or put it back towards God. The fact that God gave us everything. Watch. Whenever you say the words, look at what I've done. Watch yourself. And watch your heart. Always put it back towards God. Another thing that I think on a very positive note, I think if money can talk, I think one of the first things it would say is, I can help protect you. I can help get you through hard times. There's a passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5 whenever Paul is discussing things with this nature with Timothy. He has this to say. He says, he who does not provide for his own house or his life and his own household also is worse than an unbeliever. The idea there being that your responsibility as a Christian is to take care of those that are around you, especially those of your immediate family. If you claim to be a Christian, you've left your 92-year-old mother out to die, you're not a Christian because you're not taking care of your family. The same thing goes with your own kids. If you're not taking care of your household, that's where hospitality, that's where godliness starts, is with your own family. But when he's talking about this, the idea of protection, money allows for that type of thing. In Genesis chapter 47, listen to this story about Joseph. As Joseph is rapidly ascending the ranks of Egyptian society, he gets up near the echelon. But one of the reasons he has this approach up at the top is because he has a dream that would prove to save not only Egypt, but especially the nation of Israel. In Genesis chapter 47, starting in verse 13, it says, now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. But sometimes skip over that, but think to yourself the geography that we're talking about. Talking about Egypt that is way over here in northeastern Africa. And then you have Canaan land where these people would be before they would return, obviously after the Exodus. That's a good 600 miles in the opposite direction. So we're talking about this famine not just being a localized little event, but being, for all intents and purposes, worldwide in nature. And so this famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt, the land of Canaan, languished because of this famine. Verse 14, Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan for the grain which they brought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. Now when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food, for why should we die in your presence, for our money is gone. And then Joseph said, give up your livestock, I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph. Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said, we will not hide from our Lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle is their rewards. There is nothing left for my Lord except our bodies and our hands. These people were absolutely destitute. They were totally depraved, physically. But yet, why did they survive? Why did Egypt as a whole survive? Why did Israel survive? Because Joseph planned ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talked about this a second ago when we were talking about money being our charge, part of our responsibility with that charge is to store up things for what we need within a reasonable basis. Nobody needs to have $3.5 billion necessarily. But any savings account is not a bad idea. Preparing for a future that you know is in it. Not only that you can provide for yourself, but also that you can provide for others. Of course, the radical flip side of this is money can not only protect you, but it can absolutely destroy you. Money can protect you. It can give you a lot of things, a lot of safety, a lot of confidence. But too much attachment to that can absolutely 100% destroy you. There's a limit between preservation and just outright greed. 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul is discussing this with Timothy. And he's talking to people, or he's talking about people that would have very, very different priorities than him. And in 1 Timothy chapter 6, leading up to this verse, is a discussion about false teachers and how these false teachers would come in and want to achieve fame and want to achieve glory. And they would assume in verse 5 that godliness is a means of great gain. That for some reason they're going to become these exalted teachers and people are just going to throw money at them. Fame, glory, everything they want. Listen to how Paul responds in verse 6. Godliness, actually, verse 6, is a means of great gain when it is accompanied by contentment. If you have a highlighter or underline, highlight or underline that verse. Verse 7, for when we have brought nothing into this world, we cannot take any of it out either. If we have food and covering with these, we shall be content. But those, verse 9, who want to get rich, talking specifically about those false teachers, I think it applies to everybody. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. Verse 10, for the love of money, not money itself, the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves through with many griefs. That verse in verse 10 has been totally misconstrued by people to say that money is the root of all evil. That's not even close to the truth. The love of money, the pursuit, the unbridled lust and passion that goes along with money, that's the root of all evil. You know what Paul calls greed in Colossians chapter 3? He calls it idolatry, covetousness. Calls it idolatry. Because of this unbridled passion to just get everything that you can have in this world. And I've seen that true with people, whether they're 20 billion times over rich, 20 billionaire, have $20 billion, we'll get it eventually, or they have $20. I'll be honest, when I was poor and in college and my food budget every week was $10 a week, I struggled with it a lot of times because all I could think of is I need $20. That's my greed. Oftentimes things go by the wayside in pursuit of that. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't matter if you're rich 20 times over or if you're the poorest guy on earth. The love of money can destroy you, and it will destroy you if you're not careful. Nehemiah chapter 5 is a perfect illustration of this. Let's look at this too. Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, 'We, our sons and our daughters are many, therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live.' And there were others who said, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses, so that we might go get grain because of the famine.' And also there were those who have said, 'We have borrowed money for the king's tax in our fields and in our vineyards. Now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, our children like their brothers. Yet behold, we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our own daughters are forced into bondage already, and we are helpless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others.'" There's a fine line between greed and preparing for your future. And you can see at this point in time, these people were ravaged by the famine. With or without their fault, may not have been their fault. Look at what it caused them. It caused them to sell their sons and their daughters into utter slavery. The lack of money kept them and put them in that position. Money can help protect you if you're using it properly, but it can absolutely 100% destroy you. So that's two things we'll also do at the same time. Number one, it can show you your priorities. And Lord willing, your priorities are to get to heaven. Ezra chapter 1, if you would. Let's look at these last few verses and then we'll end. Ezra chapter 1 should be right before Nehemiah if you're there. Kind of a lengthy chapter, but stay with me. Talking about the restoration back towards Israel, the remnant that is now returning to the Holy Land, or to the Promised Land, rather. Ezra chapter 1. It says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, 'Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And whoever there is,'" verse 3, "'among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and with gold, with goods and with cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God which is in Jerusalem.'" There's the admonition. Verse 5, the response. "Then the heads of fathers' household, and Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And all those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, with valuables, aside from all that was given as a free will offering, voluntarily." Verse 7. "Also King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and put in the house of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer. And he counted them out to Sheshbazzar. I have an awful time with my S's. The prince of Judah. Now this was their number, verse 9. 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver dishes, 29 duplicates, 30 gold bowls, 410 silver bowls of a second kind, and 1,000 other articles. All the articles of gold and silver numbered 5,400. Sheshbazzar brought them all up by the exiles who went up from Babylon to Jerusalem. The first 5 verses of this chapter have a fantastic call to action. All of those whose heart has stirred up within you to go back to Jerusalem, to restore it, go do that. And let you give to help with that work. Now, what was the response? Whenever this great call to action took place for the Jews, what was the Jews' response? People giving abundantly. 1,000 articles of silver, 50 gold bowls, 5,100 total pieces of fine metal were given for the establishment of God's kingdom. You know what that showed? That showed their priorities. That what was important to them was the preservation of God's place, God's throne, God's kingdom, and they gave to help for that. My brother always says, who works in a nonprofit, he always told me, if you want to know where your priorities are, and I think this is somewhat true, I don't think it applies in every situation, but he said, if you want to know, at least in part, where your priorities are, check your pocketbook. Go into your bank account. I need to do this as much as anybody. But your money doesn't lie. Where are you giving it? Where are you focusing at? What is important to you? What are your priorities? That's what he says here. If your priorities are God, if your priorities are helping others, those types of things will show. Like I said, I don't think it applies in every situation. But I think it's a start. Acts chapter 8 is a horrible story. We won't take the time to read it. But the one thing that Acts chapter 8 shows is that heaven does not have an admission price. It has an admission price. Jesus paid it, and we have it with our obedience. But I cannot take $3.5 billion and buy my way into heaven, the mistake that Simon the sorcerer made. Simon the sorcerer was looking at all the things that the Holy Spirit was doing with the apostles, all the miracles, and what was his response? I want to buy this from you. And Peter's response back to him was one of the most vehement anti-money statements you could ever make in the entire Bible. Woe be to you who thought you could buy the gift of the Holy Spirit with your money. May your silver and your gold perish with you. There's going to be a lot of people in the day of judgment that will show up to the doorstep of heaven and will say, look at all the things that we've done. Look at all the money I've amassed. Look at all the titles that I've held. Look at all that I've accomplished. And all the physical things of the world will not impress God one bit, as much as an ounce of your obedience and of my obedience. Money cannot get you into heaven. And those who think it will, even subconsciously, are making a great mistake. There's a story about an old man who was talking with a younger man. This old man showed this younger man 2 things. He showed him, on the first step, he showed him a piece of glass, and then he showed him a mirror, secondly. And he said, when you look into the glass, what do you see? And he said, well, I see all the people outside, I see the people walking around, I see all the things that are happening outside. And then he showed him the mirror, and he said, what do you see there? He said, well, I see myself. And the old man said, exactly. The only difference between that piece of glass and that mirror is a thin lining of silver. Because when money comes into the equation, oftentimes, more often than not, people only see themselves. Let that be a lesson for all of us. Money can be a great tool. It can be a fantastic tool. And Ecclesiastes is affluent with the idea of enjoying the things that it gives. It's always within the bounds of using it responsibly and using it to further help other people. Use it for what it is. Don't let it rule you. You're here this morning, for some reason you've wandered apart from the flow. Maybe it's not money that's consumed you. Maybe it's your own lust. Maybe it's your temptations. You have this opportunity to get your life right. Focus on the only thing that matters. And focus on the cross. Won't you come as we stand, as we sing.